to understand what the doctrines are and why they are the way they are. And it's literally like having a light go on for those of us that have come in from the other confessions. And you begin to understand why Christ said what he said, how he said it, why he said it, and you read the fathers and their interpretations, and it makes eminent natural sense. It isn't something that you have to force yourself to understand or say, well, it's a big mystery, so therefore I can't understand it, or I'm not intelligent enough, or I'm not enlightened enough, or I'm not this or not. Gradually you begin to see more and more of that circle. You never see the whole thing, but you see more and more of it. And as a result, you begin to understand the doctrines of the church, and you begin to live according to them. And as a result, you become a full-fledged, increasingly, hopefully perfected member of the church, and thereby you are gaining salvation. It's not automatic, it's not guaranteed, but what is said is that if you follow these precepts, you will gradually attain that kind of what we were talking about in some of the programs that we had several months or years ago about theosis and divinization. And therefore you can begin to achieve that kind of a mentality. Whereas those who are not in the church are floundering, and we throw them lifelines. We try to help them understand, but it's a matter of their own willingness to come to some kind of an understanding and open themselves up to this. Not that we're going to force it on them, and not that we're going to threaten them with hell and damnation, because that's not the way Christ operated. That's not the way the church really operates. And that's a sign of how actually weak the Western churches have been over the centuries, that they have to use this technique of threatening and scaring people into salvation, instead of there being a voluntary, free-willed participation and cooperation with the will of God.
And in fact, what the West most objects to is that it has all of this history behind it. It has all these changes, the Enlightenment, and all these other things that have happened. The Reformation, the modernization, and most of the West feels to return to orthodoxy, to return to that circle, it has to give up what it is.
Yeah, it has to. What it really has to do is give up its ego.
Yeah.
But it doesn't see it as that. It sees it as some sort of very precious thing that it somehow has won by achievement. Unfortunately, instead of understanding the contradictions that they've involved themselves in.
And they never understood that the church even was always diverse. That the Orthodox Church was not a church which demanded that everyone had to go to God in the same way, that everyone had to walk to God. And that
How do you mean that?
There was monasticism for those that wanted to renounce the world and go into the world. There was
There's parish life.
In other words, they believed the same thing, but they could approach it differently.
And in fact, the fathers talked about that there were many ways to approach Christ. There were many ways to approach God. It's just they had to be done within the context of what the church understood to be the therapeutic methods and the methodology by which you attain
and the basic doctrines and the basic liturgical principles of the church.
Which were sent down by the Holy Spirit. And as you mentioned, the saints, these friends of God who cooperated with God by doing His will and following these precepts. And this is why they are friends, because they've humbled themselves and they've lost that worldly ego and they've joining with the ego of God, really.
And they've grafted themselves onto the church. In other words, they're not rebelling against what has been the practice of the church like Metaxaxis did, which is a very great indication that somehow or other, well, if you follow his logic out, then obviously the church has been wrong all this time. If the church is wrong, then where are you going to turn? You see, it involves you in certain very fundamental contradictions and self-contradictions, logically speaking. I mean, in a very, very simple way, that immediately indicate that this is a phenomenon, whether it be an individual like Metaxaxis or a whole group of bishops or a whole parish or a whole church or what have you, and a movement that has some significant and important spiritual maladies and viruses running about in it, like a computer virus. It's basically, it's trying to, in a certain sense, erase all the hard drive of the church, and you can't build on that. It indicates that somehow Christ has failed, that somehow the church doesn't exist to some degree, and that therefore his promises are null and void, all of which cannot be if you understand that he is truly God and is able to do what he wills with those who are willing to cooperate with his will.
And I don't think it's an accident in the midst of all of this diversity, where you have multiple Protestant denominations all believing contradictory things, where you have in the midst of that so-called agreement to disagree, which has been the whole Western experience, you see decay and violence and alienation and all of these things which are the opposite of unity. And so if we have the lab, so to speak, of the entire Western experience of history post-Enlightenment to tell us that agreeing to disagree, not having commonly held truths, ultimately does not produce compassion, warmth. It doesn't bring the highest ideals of man to the surface. It brings the lowest ideals of man to the lowest aspects of man to the surface.
All the alienation, the dehumanization that we have seen in the 20th century, the genocides, the ethnic cleansing, all this kind of thing, are profound symptoms of humanity that has gone astray. It's true there have been problems in the past in history with certain nations attacking other nations, but we have never seen the degree of depravity that we see today, left and right.
In the last 100 years.
And exactly, getting worse and worse as we watch. And why is this happening? Because people are not willing to adhere to some fundamental principles that the church has been basically advocating since day one, and some basic principles of morality and some basic principles of self-discipline and self-denial. Instead, everybody is going off saying, well, I believe what I want to believe, and the rest of it, and you get into a humanistic or atheistic kind of mentality where basically you believe nothing. And the result is you fall then into all kinds of pseudo-beliefs like communism or Nazism and all these other things.
Or occult things.
Or the occult spirit.
Look at the raft of occult-based or premised programs on television, making, this is a good demon and that's a bad demon, and you can be a good demon and that's okay because, or the Harry Potter things, and
all of which is basically moral relativism. If you have a clear conception of where God is, where the church is, and where it is not, and you see where the boundaries of that circle are, excuse me, then you have an anchor. You have some kind of a focus and a standard of values upon which you can judge things properly. But you have to educate yourself to that, and for that takes listening to what the church has been able to convey to the world over the centuries.
I'd like to thank you both for helping us bring these complicated issues into focus, this heresy of ecumenism, and I'd like to thank you once again, Father Michael Halford, who's a deacon at the Old Calendar Greek Orthodox Cathedral of St. Marcellus in Astoria, and the reader, Mr. Timothy Fisher from Holy Fathers of the Seven Ecumenical Councils, Russian Orthodox Church of the Russian Church outside of Russia.
It's been a pleasure.
And please join us again for Orthodox Christian Television. I'm Vincent Neiman, your host.